We've got Alabama. We've got LSU in Tuscaloosa on Saturday. Also, the college football playoff rankings, of course, to discuss with the playoff selection committee going to work for the first time this week. We bring in Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama here on Mark Rogers TV to help us talk Tide every Wednesday night. So catch the long form versions of the conversation, the audio on Stitcher, Podbean, and iTunes, and the video you can catch right here on YouTube. Just subscribe to my YouTube channel. Steven, how you doing tonight?
Doing well, man. It's Wednesday. It's November 1st. The month of October, that was probably the fastest October I have ever witnessed, ever. So it's November 1st, and this is where football gets real.
So this was the October. This was the one that was the quickest to slide by.
I mean, it was quick. Like, normally you would see October just take its time, but it was Halloween before you even knew it.
So why do you think that was the case this year?
Time is just flying, man.
Okay. You're getting old. That means you're getting old, Stephen.
True. True.
You're getting up there. You're going to have to let me know how that feels.
Well, yes. Yes.
All right. The college football playoff rankings, they have been in much anticipation for College Football Nation for quite some time here, because we look at the AP, we look at the coaches poll each and every Monday to see, okay, how do the teams stack up? But that's just for fun. That's just to talk and debate, but it really means nothing anymore. Now we've got a college football playoff system in place since 2014 where the polls don't matter. Now it's up to the selection committee to tell us who are the 25 best teams in America and who are those final four and who's just on the fringe, who's on the edge waiting to jump in. So our first round goes like this: Georgia at 1, Alabama 2, Notre Dame at number 3, and of course Clemson is number 4, with Oklahoma and Ohio State just waiting outside the top 4. So what was, Stephen, your initial reaction to the rankings? Is there anything they missed on, in your opinion, and maybe something that they got right that maybe you didn't expect, but you really are buying into a particular mindset?
Well, right now, I was not at all disappointed or displeased or aggravated with what the committee did. I mean, they did exactly how I would expect them to do. You look at Georgia, an impressive win over Notre Dame. Notre Dame continues to win, which is why they're number 3 in the country, number 3 in the college football playoff right now. When you look at Alabama, if Florida State would have kept winning, if it would have pulled itself up by the bootstraps and kept winning following the loss to Bama, maybe we could possibly talk about Alabama being at number 1. However, did not happen. You know, Florida State losing the game, losing DeAndre Francois, which changes the whole complexity of the Seminoles. And as good as the young freshman kid Blackman is, he's not DeAndre Francois. Of course, Jimbo Fisher built this offense. He built a lot of the hopes on the back of DeAndre Francois. That does not happen. And then after the loss to Alabama, Florida State continuing to tumble, Alabama beating the teams it's supposed to beat. But because of the fact that the Southeastern Conference maybe not as strong as it once was as a whole, this conference is really dynamic when LSU is good, when Ole Miss is good, when Arkansas is competitive, when Texas A&M is good, when Auburn's good. When the conference as a whole is good, from the coaching to the play on the field, that's when you really see the full SEC flex its muscle. But when the conference is not where it needs to be at, whether it's coaching, whether it's play on the field, now you look at, okay, who really has Alabama beaten to the point where we can look at that and go, hey, that was special. That was marquee. That was a big-time win. You know, maybe Texas A&M, maybe not, because A&M's been a roller coaster back and forth. You really don't know which A&M is going to come to the table. When you go to number 3, Notre Dame, as I mentioned, lost to Georgia, pulled itself up by the bootstraps, continues to win. Brandon Wimbush, not the best passer of the football, but he gets the job done. Notre Dame, a very solid offensive line. They can run the football. Defensively, they create turnovers. They beat a very good USC team? Can they continue to churn out wins as it heads down the remainder of the stretch of its season? We'll have to see. But Notre Dame fits very well at 3. Number 4 with Clemson, I felt like the committee took very much so into account Kelly Bryant not fully healthy when it took on Syracuse. Now, honestly, granted, could Clemson beat up Syracuse with a second-string quarterback, its backup quarterback? More than likely, yes, but they played Kelly Bryant. You can't change that now, and the committee just feels like, okay, because of the fact he was not 100%, came back the next week a lot better, played a lot better, so this is how we're going to grade that. Not my taste of how I would have done it as far as Clemson is concerned, but I'm not disappointed with how the committee went about the process.
Talking Tide with Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama. He joins us each and every Wednesday night to talk Alabama football with the Tide taking on the LSU Tigers in the SEC Western Division matchup coming up this Saturday. So here's my take on the college football playoff selections in week 1. Georgia distinguishes itself over Alabama in my eyes because of the schedule and because of the win in particular at Notre Dame, but also the win over Mississippi State in resounding fashion. So you have your eyeball test category that some people slot into, and then you've got your resume people. I tend to be more the resume track record. What were the results on the field? What was the performance on the field? So what was the score, the level of dominance? Who did you play? If you did lose, did you lose to a quality team? Were you competitive in the game, or were you not competitive? I factor in all those things. The eyeball test is the eyeball test. That doesn't relate to a scoreboard. So for Georgia and Alabama, to me, watching the teams, Alabama appears to be a better team than Georgia. And most people would agree with that, watching the teams and the level of dominance. But Georgia's been pretty darn dominant as well against the SEC and like opponents to Alabama. Alabama's really beat up on the worst of the SEC when you look at Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Ole Miss, on down the line. Texas A&M would be the best team that they've played to date. So I like Georgia over Alabama. I'm all in when it comes to the Bulldogs at 1 and the Tide at 2. Notre Dame, I think, has the most impressive schedule to date with wins over North Carolina State, USC, Michigan State, the 1-point loss to Georgia, who might be the best team in the country or one of the very best teams in the country. So I love Notre Dame's resume. They may have the toughest road the remaining way with Miami and Stanford in particular, although they've navigated, like we say, North Carolina State and USC in the last 2 weeks. So Notre Dame has made it through most of its very difficult schedule. Clemson, Oklahoma, Ohio State, you can go a number of different routes here. Ohio State obviously is the disadvantage of losing the head-to-head to Oklahoma. I'm a big proponent to head-to-head. We have 2 7-1 football teams. So when we talk Sooners and Buckeyes, Oklahoma, for as much as people want to say, hey, it's 5 weeks later and Ohio State would beat Oklahoma by 3 touchdowns. I'm not discounting that, but that's all conjecture. I believe myself that Ohio State's a better team than Oklahoma, but they played. They played in Columbus. Oklahoma won it by 2 scores. It was not competitive, seriously, in the second half. So I have no issue with that. The Clemson factor is extremely interesting with the quarterback, with Kelly Bryant in play, and with the loss being what it was, and some of the wins earlier in the season not quite as impressive as they were. Auburn's lost a second game. That's Clemson's best win, where Ohio State's best win is now Penn State. So Ohio State's best win is much better than Clemson's, and their loss is much better than Clemson's loss. But not a whole lot of depth in Ohio State's schedule, but that's coming with Michigan State and with Michigan in particular, and a date at Iowa this Saturday night. And so there's your top 6. I don't have a huge issue with it. I think it generally is going to filter through, but we've got some challenges that could be coming. Notre Dame wins out. Georgia and Alabama win out. There's a close SEC championship game. It looks like we're going to be taking up 3 spots and leaving out 3 conferences. That could be a huge, huge issue.
That could be a huge issue, and it determines on if the SEC title game was a close game, how competitive would it be? Can Alabama and Georgia both make it there? And I'm gonna tell you this. Mark. The team in the SEC and the fan base in the Southeastern Conference that's really licking its chops right now, the Auburn Tigers fan base. They're at a spot where they're thinking, we can have our cake and eat it too. And from that perspective, they're thinking, we can spoil this for two of our most bitter rivals, Georgia and Alabama, because Auburn plays them both at Jordan-Hare. But we can also now make a case for ourselves for the college football playoff. Now, granted, this is not the BCS. We do not have the Harrison poll and all those polls throwing things together. But going back to 2007, I still cannot believe how that 2-loss LSU team got in there under Les Miles and played for that national championship. Now, am I saying Auburn pulls off the same thing? No. But if you're the Auburn Tiger fan base, you got to be thinking, we got Georgia at home. We've got Bama at home. Should we maneuver this well, get to the SEC title game, and beat Georgia again? Now we have a trump card to play.
Oh, that would be fascinating, Stephen. If they beat the #1 team in the country, Georgia, then they beat the #2 team in the country, Alabama, and then back it up with another win over Georgia, who's only going to slip to, let's say, 4 or 5. They have knocked out 3 top 5 wins in the span of like 4 weeks. And they're sitting there with 2 losses, albeit they're earlier in the season. And one of them is very understandable. Clemson on the road, not a bad loss, 1 score. And we know what the weight is given to results later in the season versus losing in week 2. Auburn, that would be fascinating. That would be fascinating. That's a lot to ask. 3 wins over the likes of Georgia and Alabama.
That's like going up against Russell Crowe in the movie 300 and beating all 300 people with Russell Crowe.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. I'm not going to make that comparison, but that's an interesting analogy right there. We also have a Big Ten situation where the Big Ten could have played itself into a similar Georgia-Alabama scenario if Wisconsin winning out and Penn State had won out, and then you maybe need Wisconsin as a Penn State or as a Big Ten fan, Wisconsin to win out, and then Penn State is a very attractive 1-loss team. But Ohio State wrecked that. They appear to be in good shape, but they still have 3 more difficult games. The Big 12 is in dire straits, and it's ironic because the conference might be stronger today than it's been in 5 or 6 years. But you've got a guaranteed 2-loss team to be playing in the Big 12 championship game and a probable 2 2-loss teams playing in the conference championship game.
And you got to give a lot of credit to Matt Campbell and Iowa State. If Matt Campbell does not get a pay increase soon, Iowa State is going to lose that man. What a job he has done. You get a huge win over Oklahoma in Norman. Oklahoma, a top 10 team at the time. And then you knock out TCU, who was ranked number 4 at the time. So, I mean, Iowa State sitting there at 6-2. I believe they are 15 in the college football playoff ranking right now. They have really thrown a monkey wrench at a lot of this. And I know the Battle of Bedlam this weekend between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, but the Cyclones have really thrown a monkey wrench in what's the Big 12.
Stephen, did you have a preseason prediction for the Final Four?
I did, but it's basically going out the window.
Throw it out there. I need to know what it is.
My preseason, oh my gosh, this was so terrible. My preseason, I had Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, and Washington.
Wait a minute. What's wrong with that? Alabama's on its way. Ohio State needs to win out, but it should be in good shape. Clemson's in good shape. Washington's only got 1 loss.
Hold on. My bad. Take out Clemson. I have Florida State.
Florida State. Okay. Well, a lot of us had Florida State. So last year, I'm going to preface this by telling everyone that I'm going to brag one more time, that last year I had the Final Four before the season started: Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson, Washington. Now, this year, I had Alabama, Ohio State, Florida State, there's a lot of us, Stephen, with Florida State, and it just collapsed.
I mean, and you really thought it was going to happen because everybody was building up to the opening game. You had so many people from the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl committee, from presidents to chair members. They all talked about the greatest opener of all time. This is possibly a setup to a rematch in the college football playoff. Everything was building up to this game, and then the collapse.
Well, what I liked, Stephen, about Florida State preseason is if you look at the talent defensively, this added up to arguably the best defense in the country. Alabama fans don't want to hear that, and I'm not saying definitely the best defense in the country, but it was adding up talent-wise to be right there with Alabama, Ohio State, Clemson as the best defense in the country and the most talented defense in the country. Well, they haven't lived up to their billing. DeAndre Francois in play. And I was also looking at the body of work late in the season. So Clemson won the national championship, but they barely hung on to beat Florida State in Tallahassee last year. Also, the wins down the stretch against the likes of Florida. They won an outstanding bowl game against Michigan. Florida State just looked prime to fix the offensive line issues, which was the only issue on the team, and take it from there and make it through. And as the ACC has been in recent years, it's been a one-game playoff between Clemson and Florida State, and you figure, okay, well, we're going to get them to that point. So if they can beat Clemson, and Clemson has the issue at quarterback, the question at quarterback, then that's why a lot of people, including myself, went with Florida State. Now, Oklahoma State's likely not going to make it, but they were my other selection, and they are still alive with just the one loss and looking to make it to a Big 12 championship game. So we still have life here, Stephen. We're still, it's not as bad as it looks, but the Florida State thing is just awful.
Well, I mean, I'm not totally bummed out. I mean, half of my four made it. You know, Bama, Ohio State. So I got half of my pie. Of course, the other half is burnt bacon, but I got half my pie. So
wait a minute. You said Florida State and Washington, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Washington has some huge issues, even with just the one loss. The schedule's awful, and the Pac-12 is not looking good at this point. And the teams that they have lined up in front of them are not impressing anyone, Stanford and Washington State in particular. The two things that come into play when we look at the college football rankings and a couple statistics that are spit out at times that I would love to have a better explanation on. Number one is this projection by ESPN's Power Index of what is the probability that that particular team is going to run the table. For Alabama, it's 37%. So what is this? It's a game against LSU, good football team, but not in Alabama's league at this point. Mississippi State, same deal. Alabama should win this game by 2 to 3 touchdowns. Then the FCS game, Auburn is going to be a challenge. I just think it's got to add up for Alabama more than 37% chance of running the table.
I think Nick Saban would look at you and go rat poison, Mark. I think Nick Saban would look at you and go rat poison there. But
you're right.
I see where you're coming from. But when you look at it, for Alabama, this right here is the hardest part of the schedule because now you're facing a ranked LSU, a ranked Mississippi State, and a ranked Auburn. So now you get a chance to really prove who you've beaten versus at the beginning where you thought you had it with Florida State. You really thought you had it with Florida State, and no one expected the tumble from Florida State, but it's spilled milk now. You can't cry over it. So at this point, you have LSU, Auburn, Mississippi State. It's at the point where you can now sort of prove, okay, we've got a solid resume because these three teams ranked. We beat all these three teams when they were ranked. Now, depending upon what they do after Alabama plays them, depends on them and their psyche. But you've got 3 ranked teams coming up for Bama. It's how do you handle that?
Somebody also has to explain to me the win probability factor during the game. I understand what it is. I understand the definition. but I would love to see the computation. So, for example, I'm looking at the Ohio State Penn State recap box score summary stats after the game. Ohio State was like a 70% chance of winning that game. And you can do this with any game, especially a game where there was a big deficit that was erased during the game. And go back and look at the win probability. And it's just amazing to me that, for example, in this game, that Ohio State had roughly a 0.5% or a 1% chance of winning the game sometime in the fourth quarter around the 6 or 7 minute mark, down by 2 scores. Well, if you watch college football on a regular basis, you know that's not a great position to be in, down 2 scores with 6 or 7 minutes left, but it's not impossible. It's not a 1% chance, especially when you're the favorite and you're at home. The win probability statistic just completely passes me by. I think it's completely invalid.
Yeah, we're going to need to have, Bill Hancock, who's a part of that playoff committee, really explain that, because I think he's probably the only one that you and I can both have a cup of coffee with, Mark, and he will sit down in his recliner and actually go into deep detail on why you bring up the win probability. Because at times, I really don't get it either, but I really think if you were to talk, if we were to both talk to Bill Hancock, we would get a firm analysis on this is why we're doing this.
All right, we got Stephen M. Smith from Touchdown Alabama on the line. Please join him for his show weekday mornings, 2 to 4 Central Time on Fox 97.9. It is called The Way It Is. All right. We talked a few sleepers, Stephen, before we started to record, and you've got an interesting theory concerning one from the ACC that could slip in the back door.
I think Virginia Tech has a shot at this. Virginia Tech, they're at number 8. I want to say 8 or 9 in the playoff rankings right now. They will need some help. But if Virginia Tech can beat Miami, I think Virginia Tech right now is -2 in the point spread to beat Miami this weekend in Miami. So if Virginia Tech can beat Miami, they win out the remainder of its regular season schedule, Clemson, and beats Clemson in the ACC title game, I think Virginia Tech can backdoor its way in to the college football playoff at that number 4 seed. Provided they'll need some help. They'll need 1 to 2 teams to lose, 1 to 2, preferably 2. But I feel like they beat Miami, they win out the remainder of the schedule, they handle Clemson in a rematch, and then they find a way to get that 4th spot.
Yeah, we already know what the SEC's golden scenario is, and that's for Alabama and Georgia to make it to the conference championship game, both unscathed, then to play a classic game in which really either one barely loses and still makes the top 4, and the SEC, for the first time in the short history of this college football playoff, gets 2 teams in. You mentioned the Auburn scenario that could be the best chance for any 2-loss team in the country to make it in.
It would be lottery cash pick money. That's what that would be. And for Auburn fans right now, they're thinking, we're at a point in the season where we could possibly have our cake and eat it too. You've got Georgia and Alabama. They both have to come to Jordan-Hare this season. And if Auburn can somehow beat both of those teams in the regular season and then beat Georgia in the SEC championship game, now you're looking at a 2-loss to Auburn with a case. They will have spoiled the opportunity for their rivals and created a case for themselves. And I understand this is not the BCS era anymore. We do not have the Harrison poll and all of these polls. But I go back to 2007 when that 2-loss LSU team under Les Miles found a way to beat the system. To this day, I don't see how they did it. But the 2-loss LSU, they found a way to hustle the system. They got in, played for the national championship, beat Ohio State. So it would be of epic proportion for Auburn to pull this. But when you got Georgia and Alabama at home in Jordan-Hare, if they should maneuver this and then beat Georgia again in the SEC title game, Auburn would have a very interesting case.
So, Stephen, we've got, I don't know how many people watching us here. It's actually quite a few because I actually forgot to put on the private setting, which I typically do because I go back and edit the show into segments, but we put it on the public setting. So we've got quite a few people watching us right now, and that's okay. Welcome to Mark Rogers TV, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for the best in college football coverage. If you have yet to do so, Stephen and I get together every Wednesday night to talk Tide. I distinctly remember 2007, and that was the respect given to the SEC. That was the respect given to that particular LSU team and the schedule it played, and also understanding that a loss is a loss, but at the same time, it's one thing to lose in regulation. It's another thing to lose 2 overtime games, and that's what happened to LSU. So the argument was made that nobody beat them in regulation. Also, the last 2 regular season weeks of that season were crazy. So the team that actually finished #1 in the country and lost to LSU in the BCS championship game that year was Ohio State. Ohio State walked off the field against Michigan, season complete, having done what it could do, but it lost as the #1 team the week before against Illinois and dropped to 7 in the polls. They walked off the field against Michigan as the #7 team in the country, and then just saw the dominoes fall. Missouri, Oklahoma, West Virginia, on down the line. I forget who else was involved at that point. Just lose, and then you open your eyes a couple of weeks later, and there was no Big Ten championship game at the time. It was just the SEC and the Big 12 and the ACC, which was out of it. And all of a sudden you open your eyes after the conference championship games, and you've got Ohio State 1, LSU 2, and weeks earlier, after having finished the season, they're #7. It was a crazy, crazy time. Yeah.
That was pandemonium.
It was also West Virginia was in play as well, and they lost to a mediocre Pitt team in like a 13-9 game.
I remember that. Oh, that was terrible.
Yeah, so it's crazy. The scenarios are interesting. I will, if I get a chance over the next few days, we'll look at each conference and select the best case scenario, which we just covered with the SEC. It's Georgia, Alabama, both making it after a classic SEC championship game as undefeated teams. And the worst case scenario, so Auburn has the best and clearest path, the toughest path, but it's the clearest for a 2-loss team. But that could also come back to bite the SEC if they make it through. And let's say Ohio State, Clemson, Notre Dame, and a Big 12 champion with 1 loss, let's say Oklahoma, since they're already sitting at #5. If they all hold serve, maybe they shut out the SEC because you've got 4 1-loss teams out there. That's possible.
That is. And, woo, man. That's why you're kind of hoping Auburn doesn't pull it. But knowing Auburn, they're trying to spoil everything right now. Auburn is trying to spoil everything right now.
The only other 2-loss teams I can imagine by any shot would be able to play themselves into it would be NC State winning the ACC championship game. They beat Clemson on the way, and also Miami. And then out west, USC's got the most impressive schedule in the Pac-12, but with 2 losses in the Pac-12 apparently down, they're in not a good position. But the Pac-12 is not in a good position because their best team with the best schedule is USC, but they've got 2 losses. So they've got Washington in particular with the 1 loss, but they played a horrendous out-of-conference schedule. So not looking good for the Pac-12 right now. The Big 12 is kind of on the fence because they need the right teams to win. And the best case scenario for the Big 12 is just Oklahoma, just win on out. You're #5, win the rest of your games, win the Big 12 championship, prove that you are by far the best team in this league, and then you've got the way into the college football playoff, most likely.
Now, how much pressure really right now is this putting on Lincoln Riley? Because Battle of Bentham this weekend, you got Baker Mayfield, but Mason Rudolph can really throw the football. This is going to be a very intense game. So when you look at a guy like Lincoln Riley, you lost to Iowa State, which we're starting to figure out now, good team, but you're playing this week against Oklahoma State. How much is on Lincoln Riley right now?
Iowa State has shown us that even in even in its losses and losing to Texas by 10 points, a Texas team that took USC to overtime and has played extremely well against the likes of Oklahoma, and then Iowa State's other loss to Iowa, double overtime. Iowa turns around and they play Penn State to the final play of the game. So Iowa State is no joke. It's an amazing story that Matt Campbell has put together with a second string quarterback. Let's get us back both on track to finish this thing out, Stephen. We've got LSU at number 19 in the college football playoff rankings, taking on number 2. Let's remind everyone, number 2, Alabama. It's not the end of the world, Tide fans.
It's not. Don't jump off the ledge. Don't do it.
This isn't 1985. They select 4, so you just need to be in the 4 slot at least. So it's number 2, Alabama at home, and if you win out, you're going to be number 1 anyway, if that makes you feel better going into it. LSU, Alabama, big recruiting angle to this game as well. So we'll get to the on-the-field matchups, but recruiting, very fervent struggle between the teams in the SEC Western Division, but especially when you talk Alabama and LSU.
This is a huge game for recruiting, and ever since Saban arrived at Alabama in 2007 from his career in the NFL, and also prior to that at LSU as the head coach, this has been a marquee game for recruiting. Nick Saban and this Alabama coaching staff has been able to go down to Louisiana and grab the best of talent, whether it was Kenny Bell, Eddie Lacy, Landon Collins, Tim Williams, guys like Bradley Seal, guys like Tony Brown, Cam Sims, Hootie Jones, Cam Robinson. The list goes on. Alabama finds a way to go down to Louisiana and snatch the best of talent, the best of recruits. Even in this year's class, the 2017 class, when you talk Devonta Smith, Chris Allen, and also Dylan Moses, just getting these guys bid by bid by bid from that Louisiana area. And as much as head coach Ed Orgeron wants to keep the in-state talent in state, that starts by defeating Alabama and making this rivalry competitive. In a lifetime scenario right here, since coming to Alabama in 2007, Nick Saban is 8-3 all time against LSU as the Alabama head coach. He's 8-3, including 6 straight wins since the 2012 BCS title game off the 2011 season. The last time LSU has defeated Alabama, we all remember the 2011 regular season game of the century, final score 9-6. So for Coach Ed O, you got to start winning these types of games if you want to keep the in-state kids in state. And I got a chance to talk to a lot of former players on The Way It Is on the show this week, and they talked about how huge this game is when it comes down to recruiting, where you have a guy that has committed to Alabama, from Louisiana. They want to win this game just as much as the player that probably is not from Louisiana that committed to Alabama. Because a lot of these Louisiana kids, Mark, when they leave the bayou, when they leave the boot to come play at Alabama, a lot of these kids just get the nastiest forms of messages and hate mail and social media interactions. It just hurts because a lot of the fans, they feel like, well, you came from Louisiana, so you need to stay at home, or you need to play at home where you're from. And I get that. But when you have a coach in Nick Saban that is consistently winning, that's consistently winning championships, that's molding you as a player, that's molding you as a man, that's going to not only help you get an education, but that's going to help you win consecutive championships, multiple championships, and not only that, prepare you with the skill set to go to the next level, the National Football League, secure a lot of money, and go help your family. That's a lot to argue against. When kids see that, they're definitely going to Alabama, despite the fact that you come from Louisiana. Ed Orgeron right now does not have the resume to stack up to Nick Saban. So for LSU to really get this back on their end in recruiting, you got to start winning these games. And you may not win all of them, but it at least make it competitive again to have these recruits in a bind to where they have to question, do I want to go to Alabama? LSU starting to win now. What do I do? You got to make these recruits think again, Mark, because right now they're not thinking. They're seeing Alabama, LSU, going to Alabama.
So Coach O can sell them on stay at home, play for the state university, be right here with your friends and family, root for the home school, and bring us back to the top. Be a key figure in being at the forefront of us resurging back to the top of the SEC. Or, of course, Nick Saban has every other recruiting ploy and argument in his camp. But otherwise, there are some kids out there that don't want to be part of the factory, don't want to be part of the factory line. And instead of being lost in the shuffle of another championship, yeah, I was part of a championship team or two with Alabama, want to say, hey, we were the team. I was part of the team that climbed the mountain at LSU, that finally got back at Alabama for the first time in 6 years, that knocked them off, that got us back to the top of the SEC. And I was part of that team, and I was a pillar of that team. So that plays to some kids, depending on their character and makeup, and not knocking anyone who chooses to go to Alabama, because that's a different challenge. But that's the recruiting war that's being waged right now between Nick Saban and just about everybody else in college football, and specifically those teams in the SEC Western Division, unfortunately, have to try to just win a division championship by knocking off Nick Saban instead of possibly playing him down the line. You mentioned the 6 consecutive wins for Alabama. That, of course, started with the championship game in New Orleans in 2011/12. And then it's continued in the regular season. But most of those games have been extremely contested. You know, I think about the TJ Yeldon touchdown in Baton Rouge to pull out the 2014 game?
2012.
2012 game. Boy, I'm getting old. These years are flying by. 2012 game. Zach Mettenberger and company were outclassed in Tuscaloosa, but you had Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham Jr. and Jeremy Hill in the backfield. I thought that was going to be a little bit more competitive. That was actually the biggest blowout of the series. Of course, last season was a no-score game, the only no-score game that deep into the game in college football for the entire season, with about 10 or 11 minutes left before Jalen Hurts got loose on the LSU defense. So we've seen some really good games between these two. Of course, Leonard Fournette has had better days than what he suffered against the Tide at 2 consecutive years. But just your thoughts about what's transpired here amongst these schools, despite Alabama being the decidedly better program the last 5 to 6 years, still on the field, you're talking special talent, NFL talent all over the place when these two get together.
It's one of those rivalries that in years past, this was the game that decided the SEC West champion, and more times than not, who goes on to play for a national championship. And like I mentioned, it's been close. There have been some really close ones. I go back to 2014, where Alabama had Blake Sims. They go down to the Bayou, and Blake Sims hooks up with DeAndre White in the back of the end zone for a touchdown in overtime to win 20-13. So there have been some very, very close matchups. 2008, a game where Rashad Johnson had 2 interceptions off Jarrett Lee at quarterback, and Alabama won that in the Bayou 27-21. So there's been some close ones. It's just for LSU, it's when can we finally beat them? And I remember Devin White, LSU sophomore linebacker, who had his media viewing period earlier this week, talked about that. He talked about how, Alabama's kind of that big brother that always beats you up, always beats on you, and you can never beat them. Now I feel like we're bigger, faster, more physical. We should be able to beat them this year. I don't know if he's using that as bulletin board material or not, but that's kind of how LSU feels right now. When is it finally going to be our turn? When do we finally get back there? And they're looking at Coach Ed Orgeron, offensive coordinator Matt Canada, defensive coordinator Dave Aranda as the guys to help them get back there. Because they haven't won since the 2011 regular season. That was the last time they've won. They've had some close calls. They've had some moments where they were right there, and it's like the guy off that commercial, you got to be quicker than that. And they're not being quicker right now. So for the Tigers in this matchup, number one, that secondary going to really have to play this weekend. Dante Jackson and a couple of those other guys have really started to grow. Can you force Jalen Hurts to beat you throwing? And I know a lot of Alabama fans don't like to hear this, and you have to be very sensitive to how you phrase this. But every single quarterback that has played in Alabama under the Nick Saban era, Mark, whether it's John Parker Wilson, Greg McElroy, A.J. McCarron, Blake Sims, Jacob Coker, you name them, they've had a moment. They've had a situation. They've had a game. They've had a series where they put the team on their back and won the game throwing the football. And I get it. You don't have to have a world leader at quarterback. You don't need Superman. Just be Clark Kent. We don't need a world beater, a world leader at that position. Just manage the game, keep the car in the road. And despite all of that, all of the quarterbacks I've just named still had a moment where they took it upon themselves and forced that defense. They let that defense know, if you do not account for my arm, I will tomahawk you. I will tomahawk you if you do not account for my passing prowess. That moment has not yet come for Jalen Hurts. When it has come, but he has not really performed well yet in that moment because he hasn't been really more so asked or depended upon to do that. But at some point, Mark, it's going to be a moment in this season where Jalen Hurts has got to show that in critical moments and dire situations, he can be effective throwing the football. And for LSU, if I'm an LSU defensive back, I'm locking on to these receivers. I'm slowing down that run game as much as I can, and I want to truly see, can this kid, Jalen Hurts, really test me downfield?
Yeah, the LSU Tigers opened with a resounding win against what we thought was a decent BYU team that is typically a good team with 8 or 9 wins per season, but has turned out to be a very down BYU team. So LSU tricked us in week 1. They blew out BYU, completely dominated the game. BYU could do nothing on offense, 27-0, turn around and get blasted by Mississippi State in Starkville. And of course, the ultimate downer in the 2017 season was the loss to Troy at home. And that's when it appeared to be on the verge of unraveling completely. To LSU's credit, to Coach O's credit, he may not be the best game manager. He may not be the most elite coach, but his kids love him. They play hard for him, and they rally behind him. They get down 20-0 against Auburn, and you would think with all the issues that they had earlier in the season, what was being said about the team, what the criticisms were, what the pressures were, you get down to Auburn, who's supposed to be at the time the second best team in the SEC, 20-0, and for them to rally in that game, and that's now been the catalyst for a bit of a comeback. They have pretty much controlled the game since then. They blasted the likes of Ole Miss in particular, comes to mind, at 40-16. And Danny Etling's only thrown 1 interception this year against 9 touchdown passes. We know what Darius Geis can do. He's not having a Heisman kind of season at 4.7 yards per carry and only 5 touchdowns. But Darrell Williams has been a great change of pace back at just about 4.7 yards per carry for him as well, and 5 touchdowns. And DJ Chark gets downfield at 24 yards per reception. So your thoughts about what you've seen on the LSU Tigers offense and defense that could give Bama trouble and could make this another one of those kind of games that we talked about over the last 5-6 years where LSU has put up a stiff challenge to the wire?
Danny Etling, to me, he's not a world leader at quarterback, but he doesn't make mistakes. You mentioned 9 touchdowns to just 1 interception, does not put the ball in harm's way. But the receiver that no one talks about a lot that could really be a challenge is Russell Gage to me. Russell Gage on those jet sweeps where LSU finds a way to outflank an opposing defense, get Russell Gage on that perimeter. He's got a lot of speed. He's got a lot of acceleration. And if you cannot force him out of bounds or tackle him, he will turn on the jets and he can make a big time play. As good as DJ Chark is, and he's really good as a receiver and return specialist, Russell Gage on that jet sweep is very, very deadly when you dive into the shifts and motions that Matt Canada throws out there. I mean, also defensively, I mentioned the defensive backs with Dante Jackson leading that crew, how well they've grown in the last couple of games of the linebacking core led by Devin White, and how well they've been able to grow in the last couple of meetings, and that front line with Arden Key and Christian Lucator. If they can just limit the run, you may not be able to shut it all the way down, but if you can limit it to where Alabama's not running effectively, they're not getting those 4 and 5 yards per carry, they're not getting the big runs here or there. Every time Bama touches the ball, there's an LSU player in the hole, or an LSU player forcing it outside to where it's a minimum game to a loss. Then you're putting Alabama in a tough situation, in a tough bind. But that front seven of LSU being able to hold Alabama 1 to 2 yards a carry, because 2nd and 8, 3rd and 8 is a lot more difficult than 2nd and 3, 3rd and 2. 2nd and 8, 3rd and 8, you are really putting that pressure on Jalen. I got to throw it. I got to throw it. I got to throw it. And he's not used to really, really having that pressure on him like that, versus 2nd and 2, 3rd and 1, the entire playbook is open, and Alabama can run the ball, Alabama can throw the ball, Alabama can go to run-pass option. There's a whole lot of things at your disposal. So for LSU, offensively, finding ways to get their weapons on the perimeter, i.e. Russell Gage. Defensively, limiting the run game as much as you possibly can, and really putting that pressure on Jalen to, now you got to be the guy. How do you handle it as a quarterback from the throwing perspective of Jalen Hurts?
To your point, Stephen, Russell Gage averaging 8.8 yards per carry, 20 carries for $176 and a touchdown, 13 receptions through the air for 2 touchdowns. And on the defensive side, Devin White is tackling just about everything in sight with 80 tackles. That's 31 more than anybody else on the team. And if you follow college football statistics, you know that there's typically just a handful of guys in the entire conference who rack up 100 total tackles in a season, and Devin White has 80 at this point in the campaign, so he's well on pace to shatter 100 tackles, as well as Arden Key, maybe the disappointment on this team for sure, and throughout the conference. He was suspended at the beginning of the season. He had some off-field issues coupled with some shoulder injuries. He's only got 4 tackles for loss and 3.5 sacks. LSU very stout on defense. They played extremely well from top to bottom this season, but Arden Key is a potential top 5 NFL draft pick that has that kind of game-changing ability that they sorely missed this season. Again, other guys are really good players, but Arden Key, a special talent that really could have been the leader of an elite defense this year, and that just didn't turn out.
And he's been battling with some weight problems too. Keep in mind, when Arden Key came off suspension, he was a little bit overweight, had not been working out, had not been getting in shape. So now he has to kind of get in shape on the fly with each passing game, and that's not easy to do. There were games where he would be on the sideline just winded, Mark, looking for an oxygen tank. This is a guy looking for an oxygen tank in the middle of a football game, not in shape, breathing heavy, going through cramps. This is not the Arden Key that we thought, or college football fans thought it would see. But when you're coming off suspension, when you're not constantly in the weight room, when you're not keeping your body in the utmost tip-top shape, things like that happen.
Okay, it's Alabama LSU on Saturday almost always a classic. This appeared earlier in the season to be an exception in 2017 as LSU was unraveling its season right before everyone's eyes with the loss to Troy and an earlier blowout loss in Starkville. May put up more resistance than what we thought earlier because they played extremely well in recent weeks, taking on the number two team in the country, the Alabama Crimson Tide. But the eyeball test may tell us otherwise. Regardless, you make it in the top 4 and you're in good shape. And Alabama, of course, has its eye, as Nick Saban will remind all of us, on the one goal that it can control, and that's an SEC championship. The SEC is still special. Win the SEC, and everything else will take care of itself. All right, Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama also joined him on his show, The Way It Is, Monday through Friday, 2 to 4 Central Time. Stephen, I think we've talked out Alabama football. It's been a great session talking about not just what's coming up this Saturday with LSU, but the college football playoffs and what's possible out there, both in the SEC and nationally. It's been a good time, sir.
Been a blast, man. And as always, Mark, looking forward to every Wednesday when I'm here with you.